Hi guys, I am back and we're all set up. Cool. So let's see how many of you are on and let's get straight. Ooh, can you hear me now? That was weird. I pressed unmute and it carried on muting. So as the inevitable David Grover would say, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those people that are around. We said we would start off today with Vicky's image, which is what's on the screen. Just before we go any further, just a reminder, because I don't want people missing out, given that a huge population in the world now are going to be stuck at home for a while. You may as well capture one. So this is our first image we're going to play with today. This is the shot that we didn't get to yesterday. This is Vicky's shot. So in terms of what we are going to look at today, we're going to look at a lot of noise reduction stuff, but also some focus stacking. We're going to look at in terms of how we manage pushing the focus of the viewer up to the subject. And we've got some other wonderful pictures from Bruce, and we've got a really cool ice stack photo, which we're going to actually go into an external tool called Helicon to stack some of these images together, and we'll show you why you'd want to do that and how it works with Capture One. So first off, let's go into our cool image from yesterday. This is the end of yesterday before we got going. So this is a shot from Canada, I think, Vicky. Yep, damn sure it's Canada. I actually had a conversation with Vicky because she sent me these files. There is an issue with these files and the metadata that's in there. If we look at the bottom of our Capture One screen down here, bottom left, it's telling me this shot was at ISO 3200 for 20 seconds, 2.8, 16mm. Great. Cool. Mark sounds better today. Wicked. The 20-second exposure here, if we look at this amount of star movement, okay, and we look at this amount of cloud movement, okay. But this shot, which was the same position, also 20 seconds, also 2.8, also 16mm, also 3200 ISO. The stars aren't moving anywhere near as much, and nor are the clouds. So I know this one is underexposed compared to this one. Let's just zoom out. So there's our underexposed one. Here's our slightly overexposed one. But both of these files, for some reason, are reporting that they're the same exposure. It's not possible unless the light dramatically changed between that shot and the next, which, given the timestamp, I'll be very surprised. So we're going to assume this one was a longer exposure than this. But here's a challenge with this image, because rather than stacking these two exposures and trying to blend them, there's a reason why I'm only going to use one of them, and that's about noise. So if we zoom in here to this shot, in fact, let's go, we're going to be a bit unkind to the camera, we're going to go into 400%. So this is the underexposed version, and this is the slightly overexposed version. If we look at the noise levels, this underexposed one is far, far, far greater in terms of noise. In fact, if I try and match this exposure with this one by going to our exposure tab, let's pull the exposure up. Hopefully, even on the video link, you can see the difference in noise. So here's the one that was a pure exposure. Here's the one we've pulled the exposure up by 2 stops. Look at the extra noise that's involved in that image. So actually, even though this one's got some nice pointy stars, I much prefer the motion in the sky here, and we'll come back to that in a second. And frankly, it's just a cleaner image in those same areas. Yesterday we talked about dynamic range and how this high dynamic range function in Capture One has improved a lot in version 20. So part of that we're going to go into as well, because actually this shot is great in that we've exposed for the sky correctly, but A, we've got all that noise, and B, some of the shadows are very much underexposed. So if I really go into the shadows here, and I can tell this from this histogram, as I pull up that exposure, there's no detail in those shadows at all. It's just pulling up noise. It's creating noise because it doesn't know what was there. In fact, if we go back to 0 on our exposure, that was actually what it recorded. The same area actually had all this detail here in trees and everything. but we're missing. So we're not going to touch this image at all. Instead, we're going to use our high dynamic range tools to recover this image. So by recover, we don't mean fix a mistake. What we mean is we're going to use all of the raw data that the camera actually saw, and we're going to pull it back into the image. So we can see what the camera actually saw by pulling down our exposure in the sky. So if I slide that down. So in this sky, we've got all of this detail. We've got, actually it's blue rather than white. Yeah, there's a little bit of overexposure there. That's where the moon's obviously rising. But actually we've got a nice smooth tone here. We've got all this cloud detail, all this movement. If I were to put this back to 0 on exposure, we lose a lot of it. Now, the problem with using exposure, purely using exposure, is I'm also going to affect all of this area around here. I don't want to do that. We could use a gradient mask. We'll probably do that in a minute. But for now, let's just get started with our high dynamic range tool. So we know these are the highlights and the bright areas of the image. They're also the white areas, the top 10% of that histogram. So let's pull down our whites. All of a sudden, we've got all of this detail back here. We've got this blue color starting to come through and the detail in the cloud texture. If I pull down our highlights, we have an even more dramatic effect. So now we start looking like a night sky. The problem with the night sky is typically they're a bit darker than that. So what we will do is we're going to create a new layer. So up here, top left, layers area, little plus button. I don't need any special type of layer. I'm just going to click the plus button to create a new layer. I'm going to call this one sky. And I'm going to add a gradient, linear gradient, which is this one here, this sideways stripe. From top to bottom, yesterday we covered Luma Masks. The problem with doing a Luma Mask here is actually there's very little difference in terms of the brightness between this snow here and these clouds. So actually if I do a Luma Mask, we're going to lose some of the clouds in their capture as well. But a straight gradient, let's put the mask on so you can see 100% here, 50% of the gradient here, 0% of the gradient here. I can change that by holding down the Option key and changing this area here, or changing this area here to make that gradient harder in terms of its transition. But for now, that's pretty good at 50-50. Turn the mask off. With this area up here, I'm going to pull our exposure down just a touch. And I'm going to pull our contrast up. Cool. Now what we can see has actually happened as a result of doing that as well. And you can see here it's an ultra-wide lens. You've got a little bit of vignetting, top corners, bottom corners here. One thing we talked about yesterday is to turn on some of our lens corrections. They're on automatically here. At 2.8 we probably don't have much diffraction. Might be a little bit of purple fringing around those high contrast areas, but I can't see any. But what I can use is our Vignette tool to brighten. So everyone uses a Vignette tool to do that and make it look old-fashioned. But we can actually use the Vignette tool to brighten those corners so that we lose the vignette on the lens. Of course, we can do some other little tricks in terms of dodging and burning, but actually we've got a light fall off option in here as well with the lens correction. So if Vignette is not the right tool for us, let me just put that back to 0. What Capture One also has included in its lens corrections is this concept called light fall off. So it knows that certain lenses lose light as they get to the edges. So if I try and correct for that, if you watch in these corners, so that's without it, and slowly we pull that up. So now I've got a nice flat, even exposure across that image, rather than these dark corners up in the top left and right. Okay, so we've now got a very blue-looking image. Actually, it kind of works. What I do want to do, though, is draw attention to this path. So at the moment, if I look at the contrasty areas of the image, I've got a really cool sky up here. In fact, using that same sky gradient, I'm going to pull in a bit of clarity. Not too much, so if I do that, it's too much. But maybe down to about there, just to make those clouds really stand out. But I've got this really, really cool path that leads up towards the mountain. That's kind of our lead-in line, but because this is all grey, it's going to be a little lost. I could use our clarity tool across the whole image. Cool, but now it's starting to look a little bit too poppy, a little bit too Instagrammy. So let's do this a bit more in depth. We're going to draw, in fact, let's do this in 2 steps. No, we didn't do it in 1. I'm going to create a new layer. So this layer I'm going to call path. I'm pretty sure it wasn't actually a path. It's probably just a very dangerous sheet of cracking ice, but we'll go with that. Okay, in our path, I'm going to switch from the gradient tool to this brush tool. The brush tool, whoa, that's a big one. So if I want to change the brush, I right click, on here, or I can click on my settings here. Quick shortcut key on the keyboard for changing brush size is if I use the square brackets. Left makes it smaller, right makes it bigger. But for the benefit of you guys being able to see, I'm going to leave the size at about there. I want it really soft, and you'll see why in a minute. And opacity, I'm going to set to about 20. Opacity and flow, people get a little bit confused. Effectively, flow is the amount of this brush that it's going to be putting onto the image at any one time. Opacity is how transparent that amount is going to be. So if I have a 20% opacity and I paint that once, I get 20% of the brush effect. If I paint over it again, I don't actually end up with quite 40%. Randomly, I end up with another 20% worth, and it becomes cumulative and cumulative. And eventually you'll get near to 100%, but not quite. If I were to use flow, so if I set opacity at 100 and flow at 20, every single time I brush, it adds 20 on. So 20, 40, 60, 80, and then I get to 100. I want to be a bit more subtle than that. So flow at 100, so I want 100% of my brush detail or content, but only 20% opacity. And you'll see why in a second. Let's turn the mask on. I'm going to draw into this path. So you can see it's not that bright, dark, or bright and dark. It's not that strong, heavy red. It's not that solid red that's telling me it's 100% because it's only 20%. And then I'm going to go over it again. You see now I'm getting a slightly darker or deeper red color. That's because I'm going over it now in a way that's 40%. You actually see I've gone over the snow by accident, and that's one of the things we're going to deal with in a second. But I'm trying to feather into the edges so I don't have this hard line. And then one more. So this is, let's say it's probably 56 to 57%, something like that. And then one more, just a really strong stripe down the middle. So in my mask, I've got actually a natural sort of fall off across that path. With this area now, just that mask area, just the path, I'm going to go over to the left and say clarity up. We get all that texture, just like we did yesterday with the New York image. And high dynamic range, remember we talked about using it for recovery, so I can recover the shadows. But in the new tools in Capture 120, not only can I make highlights, for example, darker, I can also make them lighter. Just like with shadows, I don't have to recover the shadows, I can actually make them stronger, I can make them deeper and darker. Same with the blacks. And same with our contrast up here. So what that's also done though, is had a small effect on the snow up here. So instead of this brush, I'm going to go to our eraser. Eraser has exactly the same properties, but I actually want it to be 100% opacity. I want to have 100% of the effect. Really soft edge, make it about that big. And I'm going to start painting off. Oh, that's a bit too much. We're not actually going to use 100% opacity, we're going to use about 50 for now. And we're going to feather that in, that's better. So we're now cleaning up that pathway, all of my earlier mistakes. Now remember, even though we were on the snow, actually let me just show you an example. If I were to paint a little bit here, it's not going to have too much of an effect because remember I'm only affecting the shadows and the blacks. This snow isn't the shadow or black, but if I had affected the exposure, you see my mask now has a problem. So I'm getting some benefit by the fact that we're only affecting the shadows and the blacks in the histogram, as well as being only on that mask. If I was also using something like exposure or contrast or brightness, these are the global tools, that would have affected anything that was in that mask. Just like everything else, I can Control Z or Control Z in America, and I can step back all of my mistakes. Good. So we're now back to our nice clean path. That's a bit darker. If I turn this off and on again, we can see the difference. And from a distance, this just brings that path more into the foreground, more into the viewer, to see that this is the leading line they should be following into that image. And then obviously up here is our main subject. Now, one final thing we can do with this is, let's create a new Radial Mask. So let's call it Moonrise, because we can't quite see the moon, but that's where it is. I'm going to turn our mask on, and I'm going to draw a nice little mask just around this area here. Now, there's two problems with what I've drawn. One, it's quite a harsh fall off, so we're going to use this inner ring to really soften that fall off. Okay, so we've got a nice smooth gradient from 100% out here down to 0% effect down here. But that's the opposite of what I want. Now luckily, on any mask or any layer, so if I right click on this moonrise layer that I created, I can say Invert Mask. So that's now going to have the opposite effect to what I was doing before. So now the red area, or the area that I'm affecting, is in the middle, not on the outside. And that smoothing, it goes from 100% in the middle out to 0% on the outside. So with this area in here, we can have a little bit of fun with our highlight tool again and our whites. We can pull that back. We could pull down our exposure a touch, not too much. And we're going to pull up our saturation just a bit. So again, it's a subtle change, go from that to that, but we've got all that detail back in there. It's probably a bit too strong, just like yesterday. We went back up to here for the opacity on the layer, and we can pull this down. So that's 100% of what I did to 0% of what I did, and it's somewhere in the middle is probably the sweet spot. Cool. If we really wanted to, we could make this night sky even darker if we wanted to, so just one more. So this sky here has got a few effects in it, but actually I'm going to do one more over the top of all of this. A new gradient mask. Nice and soft. And I'm going to actually pull the exposure down and pull our contrast up and pull our shadows down, our blacks down a little bit. So again, it's a small difference, but it just means that it looks more like a night sky rather than a dusky sky with stars. And that's why we're going to edit this image. We have edited this image. So if I go into the detail on this image here, of course, we've also got some other functions in Capture One to fix that noise as well. So let's go into our little magnifying glass tab up here. We've got our sharpening function. Remember to be on the background layer or a layer that is filled with what you want to affect. If I just make these changes on, say, the sky area or the path area, it's only going to make those changes on those masks. So in our background area, let's go, ooh, it's a bit too zoomed in. And I'm actually going to increase our noise reduction a little bit, just to make it a little bit stronger. If I were to go into this one, the original one, the one that was exposed correctly for the sky, and I pull up our exposure to match where we were. So this is the one that we've edited. This is the one that was exposed correctly for the sky, but look at all that noise, and that's why we're not even going to touch that one. And there's no need to, because we actually got this one here looking pretty nice. Got all the star detail in there, got all this movement in the clouds, which we didn't have in the shorter exposure, and we've got a nice, really nice path going in towards it. Okay, so that's the Rockies, almost done. We're going to come back to them in a minute, but first of all, we're going to go on to a couple of other images quickly. So, one of these ones, let's start with this one. This one's from Bruce in, I think it was Montana. Let me just check. He is... Excuse me, Missoula, Montana. Okay. So, gee, you were up early, Bruce. Sorry about that. Maybe we'll do one later, later in the day, for later on in the week. Okay, so really nice seascape, really nice detail in these rocks. This happens to be a phase 1 image with one of my favorite lenses, which is very cool. Shot at f11. There might be a little bit of diffraction, so we may as well turn that on. I don't see any purple fringing, so we're not going to worry about that too much. If we put it up, it's not going to do any harm, but I don't think we need it in this case. The detail in this image is fantastic, but we've got an awful lot of space up here, and it's a little bit lost in the middle. This sun is really nice in here, though. So personally, I think this one probably lends itself more to a slightly different crop. Certainly, we're going to fix the horizon. So just like yesterday, we're going to use this little straightening tool up here. It's the arrow that circles around a little cross. And we click on one point in the horizon. Seascapes are really easy for straightening. So click on one point in the horizon, hold it down, drag across the image to the other point. We assume the horizon is level. Let go, and now we have a straightened image. Perfect. If I either hit enter or go to the hand, then great, we've applied. But it's still a bit too spacey. So personally, I would pull this down to something like a 2x3, sorry, hit the wrong one. So 2x3 image. it's also going to mean that we can lose some of this stuff in this foreground, these shallows where the water gets a bit rougher. So I'm going to place this quite neatly on that sort of 1/3 line here. Those are the horizons there. We'll keep this negative space up here. But if I were to do that, this frame just feels a bit better, and I'm just going to create a new variant of this one so we can keep referring back to the original. Okay. Again, just like Vicky's, in fact, the first thing we're going to do is let's see what we can do with our dynamic range. So on our background layer, let's see if we can pull back those highlights. Ooh, good. And our whites. Nice. So if I look at our sunshine here, quite blown out. If I look at it here, we've still got some blowout in there, but we've got a lot of the detail back in these clouds. So this was all blown out here completely. By pulling down those highlights and whites, we're able to see a lot more detail on the cloud. The reality is that you're shooting into the sun. So a lot of people are like, oh my God, the sun's blown out and whatever. I'm overexposing the sun. Well, yes, the sun is a huge, great big ball of gas that's on fire most of the time, hopefully most of the time. Shooting into the sun is going to overexpose unless you were to underexpose it by a ridiculous amount, and then you're not going to see anything else in the scene. If you're lucky and there's no haze and nothing blocking the sun, there was here, you'd get a nice little sun flare or starburst. But in this case, it's quite normal that you're going to see some elements of it, some areas blown out. Even if I were to pull the exposure down completely, let's turn our exposure warning on, you've still got this area here, which is a problem. It's just overexposed. That's quite normal. So don't try and fix something that you'll never be able to. But we can pull down our highlights and our whites as far as we can go to get this a bit more smooth and a lot more detail in there. So if I went back to this one, the original, and then have a look at here, we've got all these nice detailed lines. Okay, but we've also got a lot of detail in these rocks, which isn't necessarily showing. So let's pull up our shadows just a touch, our blacks a little bit. And then because it's rocks, well, we'll come back to clarity in a minute, but we're going to use our clarity tool on them, but I don't want to affect the water. I want the viewer to make sure that they're looking here, not at this great big space up here. So I'm going to create a new layer, sky, and really, really, really soft gradient. Now, if the gradient is rotating like this and it's becoming a little bit unwieldy and you want it to be straight, hold down the shift key and it will force it to go at 90 degrees or at 45 or at 90 degrees that way as I pull it. It means the increments go into 45-degree increments rather than freefold like I can do normally. So hold down the shift key, pull it down, perfectly straight gradient. With this gradient, we're going to pull down our exposure. Ooh, nice cool stormy sky up above. Great. That's the equivalent of if I'd put a graduated neutral density filter in front of the camera at the point that I took that shot. We'd have a darker area at the top and a lighter area at the bottom. But this is where we can get more funky, because instead of having to use two gradient filters, if I do one called water, we're going to do exactly the same from the bottom up. And we're going to pull our exposure in. Nice. So rather than having to use a vignette, and let me show you the difference. If I turn these two off and vignette this scene, it looks very traditional, old school, soft corners, all glowing. Instead of using that vignette, if I do this with linear gradients, we get the same effect of pulling the viewer into that central area, the same focal point, but we don't have the soft corners and the dark corners. We don't have this elliptical shape of doom that's coming in from all angles. We're literally just using that darkness just to bring the viewer's line up, or eye up to this line. So with the water area, I'm actually going to go a little bit further there. Sky area a little bit further as well. Ooh, looking moody. That's cool. Right, talked about clarity just now, so I'm going to create a new mask. And let's go onto our brush. Now remember, the brush settings will remember what they were doing the last time. The last time I only had 20% opacity, so I'm going to change that to 100. Size is okay. Let's go a little bit bigger there. And oops, let's paint. So I'm going to paint over these rocks very roughly. And we're going to go back into the cool tool that we talked about yesterday, which is the Luma Mask. Hi, Topi Ukol. Okay. Hi. So with our mask here, that's obviously selected all of the rocks, but also the sky around it. If I were, for example, to bring up the exposure, I'm going to affect everything that I masked. Even if I affect clarity, I'm going to get this weird, remember I talked about yesterday, this halo effect if you do clarity wrong. Well, there's an example of it. So let's choose a Luma range instead. So I've got my mask, but instead of choosing everything that I painted, this is a very lazy way of getting a very accurate mask. I don't want anything that is not the darkness of those rocks. So instead of yesterday we were pulling everything down from the left and into the middle, this time I'm going to pull everything from the right into the middle until I see only my rocks appear. Nice. And then I don't want this really harsh tapering off, so we're going to use the fall off slider there. Oop, that's a bit too much. Let's get it right. Into there. That looks good. So I've now, with a Luma range on that painted mask, isolated just these rocks. If I apply that, now here's a fun one. As long as I'm happy that I don't want to edit that Luma range again, I can click on my eraser. Let's set this to 100, because if I look carefully, there's some extra bits that I shouldn't really have captured in that Luma range, and it's because their brightness is just too close to the rocks. So with our eraser, I can now erase part of the mask that I put in, still editable. There we go. So with a couple of little clicks, I've got perfect masking around those rocks, and I'm not going to affect anything else. So now with that mask, and let's call it correctly rocks. Now with that mask, let's zoom in a little bit closer in there so you can see. We're going to pull up our clarity to make those rocks stand out. We're going to pull up our structure a little bit. So structure is all about the line detail. Let me show you up close. So here is the difference with clarity. Let's just reset both of those. There's clarity. Now it's taken, remember we talked about it being a mid-tone adjustment. So this is actually pretty dark. It's going to struggle to see many mid-tones in there, but there are a few there. So clarity, okay, it's going to make everything pop a little bit, but it's also having the effect of making the dark areas darker. So instead in here, what I want to do is see all the detail, and ironically, the word is there in front of us, and the structure in the rocks. So if we pull up our structure, and if I do it too much, what you're going to see is those horrible lines where something's been over sharpened, especially around the high contrast edges. But what we can do is just pull that in to there. So it's having an effect on the rocks, but it's not affecting the edges too much. If I am concerned that it's affecting the edges a little bit, remember, it's still a mask. So I can go onto my erase tool, and I can very softly, let's go to about 40% opacity, I can reduce the amount of that effect on the edges of the rock. So that then gets rid of the risk of having any of these rock edges, the high contrast points between the bright sky and the dark rock, producing any halos. So we're still having 100% of the effect that I wanted in the middle of the rock, which is to pull out all the structure in those rocks and all the detail, but only about half of the effect as we get near to the edge of the rocks, because that's what I'm just feathering off now. And you can see where we're reducing the strength of the red mask, that's the area that's having its effect reduced. If I turn the mask off, lovely. So what I can also do again with this mask is we can pull up our exposure just a touch, just to bring them up. And I'm going to put some contrast in there as well. Nice, let me turn that off. So they're a little bit washed out. Turn it on again, we've got a lot more detail in those rocks. We could play around with color balance a little bit if we wanted to. Doesn't really need it, but let's just cool it down a touch and just head our tint up the scale a little bit there. So those changes, we've got 3 layers. We've got our base background, which has had its high dynamic range corrected or recovered from all that highlight area. We've got a sky mask, which is darkening the sky, bringing all the focus down to these rocks and the sun. We've got a water mask, which is doing exactly the same from here down to there. And we've got our rocks mask, which is just bringing up the detail in the rocks, which is not going to be too apparent from far away. But when I get into the rocks themselves, without and with, we can see a lot more. There are also a couple of little things in here. which we could get rid of. We can try and get rid of with this spot tool, but instead I'm actually going to use a healing layer. So we're going to create a new heal layer. This works just like yesterday's. So here's a brush, and we're going to choose 2 points. The first point is this source, so I want to take a bit of this water here, and I want to paint it over this bit of debris there. Nice, that's gone. There is a dust spot there, so we're going to use our dust spot tool, and that gets rid of that one. So the dust spot tool is up here. When I'm on the dust spot tool, don't forget the setting that you have, which is in the magnifying tab as default, which is the type of spot that you're removing. Is it dust, as in sensor dust and lens dust, or is it a spot on the lens? In this case, the spot tool is going to be doing a better job for us than dust. And, oh, there's one there. Let's just do that one quickly, because then we can say we're properly done. So there's another little spot there. Let's just increase our brush. So I'm using the keyboard, the square arrows again, but I could actually do it by right-clicking and then changing the radius. And that one's gone there too. Perfect. So there's our original. Nothing wrong with the image. It's correctly exposed for what you can get away with pointing into the sun. Here's our finished one, which to me just looks a bit more like a piece of art on a wall than the original started out with. So this one's got a lot more mood, it's got a lot more detail, and it's making full use of that range that that phase 1 camera is capturing. Okay, sticking with some of the, or this image here from Bruce again. I think that's the second, yeah, it's the second image from Bruce. I just want to show you in detail that healing and cloning tool and where in particular we'd really use it. So again, seascape, wonderful rock, loads of detail and texture in here. It's perfectly focused. There's even a little bit of wind there that's moving those bits of grass, shrubbery. Yeah, what are we at? 80mm, 200th of a second. Cool. Loads of detail on the sky, nice long exposure. This 1/200th of a second for this exposure is telling me that it's part of a sequence. So it's likely this was a frame averaged image, which is something the phase 1 cameras can do, where instead of 1/200th of a second in a frame, what it's actually done is captured lots and lots and lots of 200th of a second frames and then averaged them out to give you the effect of a long exposure. So obviously for this to be a 200th of a second, these clouds have to be moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour. They weren't, but that's the function of the phase 1. First thing I'm going to do, just because it's going to annoy me, is remove this little dust spot. So dust spot tool at the top, just like before, click. And actually that one's a little bit bigger, so we're going to click on it again, and we're going to make the radius a bit bigger. There we go. It's done a better job of it that time. Second thing I'm going to do is just check our horizon, because I think it's pretty accurate, but it's maybe a little bit down on the left-hand side. Yeah, just a touch. Okay. What I'd like in this image is for it to become either a 1x2, yeah, actually probably a 1x2. So let's go 1x2, and remember that fixed radius or fixed proportion up here by selecting 1x2. Anything I do with the mouse is going to keep me at 1x2. I can't change that now unless I override it by changing a different aspect ratio. I want to put this rock at maybe there. Actually, I want to get that in. We're going to actually go up to 3x2, just like we had before in the previous image. So 2x3 image. Let's just make sure that's going to fit on the frame. Okay, so I'm actually going to pull it in a little bit here. What I want to do is get this line in this bottom corner, this right-hand line up here, because this is wonderful, all this texture in here, all this reflection here. And it'd be nice to have that right off into that corner leading up into the image. And also it means that we can keep all of this sky effect up here. So from a composition point of view, I like that. That works. But now I've got a problem with this bottom left. And the problem is when the image was a full image, let's just create a new variant so you can see. So the full image here has some context into what this is. It's obviously the bush that's leading down into the beach. However, on our cropped image, let's just view it as it would be. It just looks messy. It just looks like it's a mistake. It shouldn't be there. So I'd want to get rid of it. But if I get rid of it, where am I going to heal from? And let me show you. So if I were to create a new heal layer, and let's choose the size of our brush there, Lovely. We'll make our hardness not, so it's nice and soft. And I'm going to choose our source there. And our destination, I'm going to paint. Lovely. Oh, we get all this dark stuff. And one of the reasons is because it's actually working out compared, this healing tool is working out compared to everything else around it. And obviously off the frame, off the crop, is all of this dark area. So it's trying to blend that. It's trying to be clever. But in being clever, what it means is we've got this dark area here. And no matter what I try and do with the healing brush, we're going to get the same effect. But I have a benefit in that crop. And the reason that I did that crop in that way, in part, was because I can now use, let's just reset our, our crop out, just for the purposes of editing for now. So I've got all this spare beach down here that I didn't actually use in the final image, because our image is going to crop along here. So instead of this layer here, let's delete that layer. I'm going to create a new clone layer. And with our clone layer, here's a brush. I'm going to say, right, take some of this sand, which is going to be off of the image, and let's paint it up here. Ignore the preview thing that's coming up. There we go. So I've just painted some of this sand that no one's going to need or know was from here because it's going to be off of the crop, and I've applied it up to this top. No dark areas, no issues, looks great. Let's go back to our 3x2 crop. Let's make sure we're up into that corner there, that lead in. Wonderful. So now we've got that clean beach. This was actually a part of the other beach, just a bit further down, but we've got rid of that, that bush. There is a question in my mind as to whether or not we would leave that rock in there. It's personal choice. There's two schools of thought. One is that was natural, that was there. The other is if it's distracting, get rid of it. Up to you. In order to get rid of it, what we would do is create a new heal layer with our brush. You're going to know this by now. And let's go there to there. Wonderful. And that's now nice and neat. David's just asked, why don't you show your dust spot identification trick? So in the next image, I will show you the magic dust spot identification trick that you will either love or hate. The reason you'll hate it is because it's going to create a lot more work for you. The reason you'll love it is because that work is going to result in a much cleaner image. Sorry, right. So with this shot, we're actually going to apply a style to a layer above as well. So yesterday we touched on these built-in styles in terms of the IQ styles. They can only be applied to the background. Oops, didn't mean to do that. But if you've either bought any of the styles from Capture One or you've want to look at any of the presets that are built in, we can look at some of these styles here. Let's go. Ooh, cool look 2 looks quite good. If I right click on one of these styles, I can not only just apply it to the background, I can apply it to a new layer. If I had a layer selected, I could apply it to the selected layer as well. Let's apply it to a new layer. And then what I'm also going to do, let's see if we can stack a couple of layers. Let's go to, there was a color, black and white. There was, I think it was one, oh there we are, warm look. Let's go for number 2, add to a new layer. Okay, so this is my styles tab up here. Any purchase presets you're going to see in here, but you're also going to see any of the built-in styles that come from Capture One. Back to my exposure tab. I've now got these 2 extra layers. One is warm look, one is cool look. So without them, we're here. I can add my cool look, bit too cool. So with this layer again, opacity still applies. I can apply less of it. And then with my warm look, yeah, that's cool. But with my warm look again, I also want a bit less of it. So I've just gone from this to this toning, which has taken some of the warmth out of that sand with that cool look, but it's kept some of the detail on the nice browns and oranges and little bits of green in that rock. Okay, final couple of tweaks. Let's create a new layer, and I'm going to create a gradient up here, slightly off center. The reason I'm going slightly, so not exactly vertical, I'm following the line of the light. I'm not following the line of the image, so I don't care about the horizon. I'm caring about the fact that there's more bright white areas in the top left of the image than there is in the top right. So we're going to pull down from the top left, down across here to there. And then with that, we're going to pull our exposure down a tiny bit, but also we're going to pump up our clarity. So look at what that's done to the clouds. If I go back to around 0, nice smooth clouds, but not much texture in them, not much detail. And then by pulling up that clarity, we've got all this hard lines and everything, which is what we were trying to capture with a long exposure. I'm just going to pull that there so we don't get a halo around that rock. I could also do the same thing with this sand down here. So let's just pull another one up here, another little gradient. And we hold down the Option key to make it fall off faster. So by fall off faster, we mean rather than a really small or smooth gradient from here to here, it goes from 100 to 50% there, and then falls off very quickly down to 0 as we get to here. Okay, let's turn that off, and let's pull our exposure. Ooh, maybe not. Let's pull our clarity up a touch, just to get some more texture on that beach. And I'm actually going to pull up bit of brightness and saturation on it, which will allow me to darken it overall, but with a bit more color. Okay, so if I turn that off and turn it on, we've got a much more defined line down here. And that's probably it on this shot. It's a nice seascape. We got rid of some of the dust spots. You've got a style added as a layer. In fact, you've got 2 styles added as a layer. And then we've got our clone layer, which has got rid of that beach. So if we went to the original there, nothing wrong with that shot. But to me, this one then, again, just feels more like it would hang on a wall without some of this distraction in the bottom corner. So those two together, really nice images. Nice one, Bruce. Let's go into a focus stack. So we are going to, because I left Vicky hanging yesterday, we're going to go into hers again for this focus stack. So focus stack image, for those that don't know what we're talking about, sometimes the foreground subject you're trying to capture is so close compared to the background subject, and you want the whole thing in focus. So even if I were to be able to shoot this at f22 and still keep some sharpness, you would still struggle to get the background in focus at the same time as the foreground. The difference is just too great. Also, we don't really want to be shooting at sort of f16, f22 in an ideal world. We'd rather be shooting around f8, f11. And obviously with f8 and f11, you're going to get even more shallow depth of field, so even less in focus. So let's take this one for an example. This is shot at f16. So f16 on an ultra, this is a 12mm lens. So f16 on a 12mm lens has quite a lot of depth of field. So all the stuff near to the camera, this is lovely and sharp. Yep, cool. So let's just go up the image. Oh, it's now not so sharp. And oh, our mountain is really not sharp. So even at f16, because I focus so close to the camera, the whole image isn't in focus. So the fix obviously is, okay, well then let's focus on the mountain. Cool, so the mountain's now nice and sharp. Wonderful. But our foreground isn't. So there's a tool called focus stacking. It's a method of doing things. Hi Bruce, you're on, cool. So don't forget, with these images, we'll send you the EIP files back that you can open in Capture One, whether that's a trial version or the full version, doesn't matter. You'll be able to open them. So with focus stacking, what it does is it instructs the camera. You can do it manually on the camera, but a lot of cameras have now got this built in. It instructs the camera to say, okay, here is my nearest point, here is my furthest point. Take a sequence of photos and shift the focus with each click that you do. So I get a series of photos of the same subject, but effectively they're at different focal points. So in this case, Vicky's got one here, which is done for the mountain, one which is done for the middle point, and one which is done for the foreground. So this is sharp, that's not, that's really not. In this one, this is sharp in the middle, this isn't. And in this one, the mountain is sharp, but the middle isn't, and the foreground isn't. And then you blend it. Now, blending it is actually a very difficult challenge, and I'll show you one in a minute that will really show you how challenging it can be. But what there are tools that integrate with Capture One to do it, and one of them is called Helicon. So first thing we're going to do with this image is I'm going to show you, as David pointed out, the magic dust spot identification trick. So in this image, I don't know whether you can see, I don't know who can tell me how many dust spots they think they can see, but I can count 1, 2, 3, 4, not sure if that one is 1, but okay, so maybe 4, maybe 5. Okay. If I want to see dust spots, typically, remember I mentioned yesterday the clarity tool is a mid-tone enhancement tool. I can create a new layer, a filled layer, because I want to apply 100% of what I'm going to do to that layer. And I'm going to call it Dust Finder. And this new layer, I am going to whack that clarity up to as high as it can go. Now all of a sudden these dust spots are a lot clearer. And also I can put our structure up. And also I can push our contrast up. And I can pull our exposure down a little bit, which will help. Do you see how clearly those dust spots now show up? So if I take this off, that's the image. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with doing the dust spot corrections in that way. But this allows me to see where those dust spots are. Now, I'm never going to use this layer. We don't want this image to look like this. It's going to look horrible. However, I can use this layer as an overlay while I'm fixing the dust spots. So, for example, I would go back to my background layer. This layer is still visible. Go to my dust spot tool. I'm going to make it a lot smaller using the keyboard, that little square bracket again. Yeah, Vicky, mirrorlesses are more of a challenge with dust spots, but that's still no excuse not to clean your lens and your sensor. Let's click there, 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 click there. This one here, actually, I'm not going to do the dust spot tool because it's probably going to make a mess of it. Instead, I'm going to create a new heal layer underneath my dust finder. And I say source is there. Paint it in there. Oh, stupid me. I created a new dust spot because I didn't choose the brush tool. So there's my source. And here's my destination. And I'm going to paint that in there. Wonderful. Okay, so let's get rid of that. So obviously with this showing up all my dust spots, that's nice and clean. If I turn off my dust finder layer, it's completely clean. So I always, if I'm worried about dust spots, we create one of these layers, and the trick with this layer is turn your contrast up about halfway on that slider, put maximum clarity about halfway on the structure, and then pull the exposure down until you can see all those dust spots. Once you've seen them on this layer, go back to your background layer, use the dust spot tool on the top menu, get rid of them as much as you can. If you can't get rid of it using the dust spot tool, create a new healing layer underneath that dust finder so you can still see it. Choose the source, paint there, lovely. And I think, oh, there's one up there. Nearly got them all. Just get rid of those. Oh, one there. One there. And there's a little, oh, maybe a cloud. Okay. So with that dust finder layer, that's going to make your dust spot finding a lot easier. So again, maximum clarity. Let's go back to that layer. Maximum clarity, halfway structure. Pull up your contrast about halfway and then pull your exposure down until you can see any spots. I can now delete that dust spot layer. Great. Don't need it anymore. And there's our nice clean image. And we know it's clean because even at maximum contrast in every area, we couldn't see anything. With our, in fact, I'm going to create a new filled layer on top of all of these. And we're going to call this one HDR. Not HDR in the sense of blending images, but just like before, we're going to try and rescue some of these highlights and the whites, especially in the sky. Again, remember, the shadows and blacks, I don't have to make them recover. I can also make them a bit darker, and I might want to on this one. So let's go back to our blacks and pull that darker. Yeah. So that's now pulling this foreground in into a lower area of the histogram. Overall, let's pull our brightness up a touch. I might be tempted just to play with our white balance a little bit. If I choose the snow, yeah, so it's quite yellowy light. Let's pull that coolness back down again. I'm sort of in a place of there. That sort of works for me. Okay, so we've done all that on this image. That's absolutely wonderful. So now you've just got to go and do that exact same thing to the other two images that we're going to stack. Only joking. So that would be a real pain in the ass if we had to go back into this image and fix the same dust spots that we knew were there. But we've just got to do them again, and they would be done differently because you might not click the exact same pixels. So as a result, there's an easier way of doing that, which is work on one image first if you're going to focus stack. Get all the corrections done, and then adjustments, copy adjustments. Click on my other two images, adjustments, apply adjustments. Now those adjustments should have taken out all of the dust spots apart from, how odd. Let me try that again, just in case we did something stupid. So I'm going to copy the adjustments here, paste them there. Weird. Okay. Bear with. Things never quite go correctly. Let me just check something. Because I may have been playing around with this earlier, which may have gone wrong. Let's just make sure we've done it right. Okay. I may be doing something wrong here, and I'm in a bit of an infinite loop. So we'll come back to it separately another time. But for the purposes of this, let's just copy that and paste those adjustments into there. Okay. We'll assume that those dust spots have gone, although why they haven't copied across, I'm not entirely sure, because they normally do. Okay. I've got my three images, and these three images are focused differently. So we've got our focus in the foreground on one of them, which is this one, 245, midpoint in this one, and out in the distance in this one. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to go to edit with, and we can say stack in Helicon focus. So by stack in Helicon focus, what we mean is take all those images and use this external tool called Helicon to create a focus stack. So it's going to say, do you want to keep the process variants? Yes, I do, because I want to come back to them. How do you want to export it? Well, a TIFF 16-bit is the highest quality that we can get, and we're at 300 DPI, 100% with Adobe RGB. Ideally, don't use sRGB as an output, please. It's a very limited color profile. It's great for screen, but when you go to print something, if ever you do in the future, you're going to be missing a load of colors. So we can then click on Edit Variants, and it's going to process those three and send them into Helicon. When this loads, a little bit weird because you can't see the actual window that I can see. Let's pull that one up. There we go. Okay. So in my Helicon screen, I've got these three images. We know that they're the ones that we were just editing. So number one, number two, number three. If we look above this mountain, as you can see now, as we can stack them, we can actually see a couple of things happening. The water is changing, but also these clouds are moving quite a lot. So on the one hand, it's great. It's going to do some clever stuff and get the focus correct. On the other, we're going to find that these clouds cause us a problem. So for now, let's just leave it on method B, which is the depth map, which is the default, and render it. Let's just see what it does. So it creates a bit of a clever depth map, and it works out which bits are the bits that are in focus, which bits are the bits that aren't. So if I were to go on to our image here, look up here at the sky. So this is a bit of a problem, because what it said is it's gone for the bits that are sharpest in the image, which is perfectly correct. So what it said is this bit sharp, so we'll use this bit from this image from 245. We'll use this middle part from 246, and we'll use the top part from 247. However, the clouds were the same in each of the three images. So it's tried to be clever and say, well, obviously you wanted all three of them because obviously they're all sharp. Let's just zoom in a little bit into those clouds. And up here. Okay. Now, in our 247 image, it's nice and clean. What we can do then is, instead of saying 245, 246, no, blend them all. No, I want just 247. So with 247 on our rendered output, I'm going to brush. So hopefully this makes sense. It's saying on the left-hand side is the source from 247. 247 was the one that had the correct focus for the mountain. We only want those clouds. There's no point in trying to blend the other clouds from the other focus stacks, the focus stacked images, sorry. Because A, they're going to be slightly out of focus, and B, you're going to end up with that horrible multiple cloud effect up on the top. So what I'm doing is I'm brushing and telling Helicon, I only want you to take the clouds and the mountain from 247. The rest of what it's done down in the river and in the focus, I'm going to show you in a second, is perfectly fine. So if I go down here, we now have an image. Let's actually go to, let's say 50% so you can see it a bit clearer. So look on our left hand side. This was the image which was focused on the mountain. That's no good to us. This is unsharp in the foreground, but it's taken the foreground on the right hand side from image 245. And then as we move up, 245 had a slightly blurry river on the left hand side, but 246 had a nice sharp river in the middle, or in the midpoint of the image. And then as we move up, 246 had a slightly blurry mountain, but 247 had a nice sharp one. So it's built a map around the sharpest areas of the images. It's blended them automatically together for you. And then we can literally go to, on our save button, saving, save, we export it out as the TIFF, and that will then come round trip back into Capture One. Let's just go back in. Whoops. There we go. Okay. So this is actually going to sit in Capture One and wait for, I've just cancelled this, the process, so that's my fault. I'm just going to cancel this. This will then come and sit down here within our folder, and then we can use that image. But remember, it's a TIFF at that point, so all the functions I had with raw, with white balance, with tint and everything like that is gone. Just to show you an extreme version of this, just so you can get the hang of it. David's just asked, do you need a separate license for Helicon? Yes, you do. They've got two models. One is a annual license. One is a perpetual one. I can't remember the exact costs for it, but it's around maybe $100, $200, something like that for a year. I think maybe $100 for a year. Here's an extreme one. So this is a, where are we at? 17 image focus stack. So let me just zoom out. I'm just going to finish on this one for today. So here is a stack from Iceland, where as I scroll through, you'll see the ice block get more and more in focus. That's nice and sharp in the ice block. But the background wasn't, and the foreground isn't. So we were so close to this ice block, it's very difficult to do. Now in this shot, we've got a nice sharp background ice block here. About halfway through, we get some nice sharpness on the block here. Bit further, really sharp here, but the background's blurry and this bit's blurry, and then at the very end we're in a place where this ice here is really nice. I'm going to pick up all these images, select them all, right click, edit with, stack in Helicon Focus, keep the variants, TIFF 16-bit, Adobe RGB, great. Don't want to do any sharpening at this point because I'll do that later on. Bring the metadata across, edit. We're going to pull up a little activity bar, and it's going to tell us 17 images, about a minute left to do it. I'm just going to switch across into Helicon, where it will get those images as they come through. So what this is actually doing, if you think about what Capture One's got to do right now, it's creating, these are 150 megapixel images. So it's creating 17 150 megapixel 16-bit TIFFs. So this is a huge amount of data that Capture One is outputting, but also Helicon's going to have to interpret. So while it's going through that, I'm just going to cover a couple of other little bits. Where were we? Our moonrise shot. One thing to bear in mind, and one of the only reasons that I would have been tempted to keep this image over this one that we started off with this morning, or this morning earlier, is the amount of star movement. So quite rightly, in an ideal world, we don't want stars to be lines. Vicky actually has another version of this file, here, which is a much longer exposure because it was ISO 800, which is great from an image point of view, and from a noise point of view, it's a much better controlled image for noise. But look at our stars, they're just too long a trail. They're more of a trail than they are a point of light. If you're going to do this, doing it to a huge extent where you get the massive, great big long star trails that go in a circle around the pole, that looks wonderful. But there's a sweet spot, and it has to be longer trails really to make it look correct. Otherwise, you are better off sticking with a slightly shorter exposure, even if that means a little bit of noise. And on this shot, remember, overall, we can, of course, create a new filled layer, pull down our exposure a bit if we want it to look a bit more like the night sky again. It's still pretty clean. If I compare this shot to this one, the amount of noise is exceptional. Okay, so Helicon has just loaded up. Let's go into our application window for this one. So here's our ice, all of those different ones. And let's watch what it does. So this one here is focused on this ice block here. As we move through, it's going to get nearer and nearer until we get to the foreground here. I'm going to click render. If I did this manually in Photoshop, I would have to load in 17 different images as different layers. I'd have to go through every single layer and work out which bits are sharper, which bits are softer. And I'd have to mask around those sharp and soft areas to get the full image blended as one. So from my point of view, if we're going to do focus stacking, and it's becoming more and more popular, this process and this application is one of the best tools out there to do it. Capture One doesn't do this natively, but Helicon is a nice little plugin to add into Capture One. And it's done it now. That's it, nice and quick. If we look at this picture on the right-hand side, look at how clean and crisp and sharp that is, all the way from this bit down here, all the way up to this ice block in the background. If I thought something was wrong, again, I could go into that retouching panel and I could choose my brush and I could correct it from each of the individual TIFFs. But in this one, it's actually got it, from my perspective, pretty much spot on. If we look at how sharp, oops, that's 100%, that might be a bit too close. Look at how sharp this ice is here on the right compared to the one that's focused in the background. And then likewise, if we were to go into the background, this ice block here, we've got a nice little bit of detail in that ice block, whereas in the other image, which was correctly focused down here on the bottom left, this ice block is completely out of focus. So Helicon has added all those things into the stack, and it's delivered one image, which we can then go to saving, go to save, and render it. You can also export 3D models and all cool stuff like that, but then get one TIFF out of all of those original 17 files, which is, there we go, there. Let's go back to those files. I don't know about you, but the thought of sitting in Photoshop and manually going through each one of those individual files to the point where I have to manually go through and choose which bits are sharp in this one, which bits are sharp in this one, which bits are sharp in this one, and lay them all out, feels like a real pain in the ass. The fact that these guys at Helicon have already done it for you, I would just personally use that plugin. It's great, it does what it says in the tin. So that's it for today. Those edits done. Bruce, Vicky, I will send you your stuff later on via WeTransfer, so you can get the EIPs. When I send you an EIP, that's a form of a package. So that means it's got your original raw file. So in Vicky's case, it would be the CR2 file, but it will have been edited with some, effectively all of the layers and all the details, and it's saved into a little package called EIP. That can be opened in Capture One. Whether or not you have Capture One, you can open it in a trial version for now, or go on to that deal if you want over the next, we've got another 10 hours or so before the 25% off fails, and get hold of Capture One before it's too late. The next session we do will probably be later on this week. For those people that want to send us stuff, remember, send it through that tool. So paulreeferlive.wetransfer.com. We then get a copy of the raw file. We'll edit it on screen, send you back the EIP that you can then open in a Capture One version of your choosing. And that's it. So that's it for today. Cheers. Hopefully there are no other questions. If there were, then just add them into the comments on this file, which will be on Facebook forever, and we can answer away. Okay, cheers. Bye.